Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Mouin Rabbani. He's a non-resident fellow with the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Mouin, thank you so much for joining us.
It's very good to be with you. Thank you.
Of course.
Let's start with, if you could, characterize the nature of, or I guess maybe even the specifics of this ceasefire, to the extent that we know all of them, which for the most part we do, but also relative to what had been agreed to and then unilaterally subsequently broken in January of this year.
Well, let's start with January. In January, the incoming Trump administration essentially compelled Israel to accept an agreement that had been on the table at least since May, according to the Qatari mediators, for a year. But it later emerged that Trump's main priority was to have a diplomatic achievement and not a foreign policy crisis on the day of his inauguration on the 20th of January. That was a three-stage agreement. And at the end of the first stage, the United States basically authorized Israel to unilaterally renege on it, to resume its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip and to continue until last week. I think the key turning point was the U.S. bombing, the Israeli bombing of Qatar several weeks ago, or several months ago, in which it sought to assassinate the Hamas negotiating team, which was meeting to consider a proposal that had been forwarded to them by the United States. That attack failed, but it also made clear to Washington's closest Arab allies in the Gulf that they were not safe from Israel, that their national security, their sovereignty also hung in the balance, and that the U.S. was prepared to support bombings of their capitals by Israel. And in that context, a number of Arab leaders and leaders of Muslim states met with Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly last month and impressed upon him the need to bring this crisis to an end because it was now affecting them directly. They worked out a 21-point proposal. Netanyahu showed up in Washington, managed to introduce substantial revisions into that proposal, and it was unveiled on the 29th of September at a joint press conference at the White House between Trump and Netanyahu. That proposal deals with three sets of issues. The first is the immediate crisis, if you will, an exchange of captives, a cessation of hostilities, beginnings of an Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and a surge in humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, where famine conditions have taken root. On the 8th of October, Hamas and Israel reached agreement on that, on those immediate issues, and that is what is now being implemented, at least in significant part. The second part of that proposal deals with what are known as post-war arrangements, governance and administration of the Gaza Strip, the issues of Palestinian weapons, and so on. Hamas has not accepted those elements of the Trump proposal, and those still remain to be negotiated. And particular sticking point is going to be this idea of turning Gaza into a kind of foreign protectorate, which will be presided over by a colonial viceroy, none other than Tony Blair. And this is something that the Palestinians have categorically rejected. It has been reluctantly accepted by the Palestinian Authority. But I think that proposal is essentially dead in the water. What hasn't been addressed, except in the most tangential manner, are the political issues that have produced the crisis that we're now discussing. And unless those are addressed, we're essentially going back to the situation that existed on October 6, 2023, in which the countdown to the next catastrophic eruption has already begun.
What was the third point in those things? Post-war arrangements, weapons, and then is the third point the long-term?
Yeah. The third one let's say the broader political issues, where essentially the proposal said nothing. It merely noted for the record that Palestinians have an aspiration, not a right, to national self-determination and statehood. But beyond that, it said nothing. And that was confirmed yesterday at this summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, where the leaders of the United States, Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar signed this document. And if you read it, it basically does little more than, hail Trump as the greatest peacemaker in history and says that everyone wants peace. But what exactly that peace is supposed to be, what it looks like, what are the rights of the Palestinians, and so on, none of that is dealt with in even cursory fashion in this document that was signed yesterday.
You mentioned that at the UN, leaders from Qatar and perhaps other Arab nations impressed upon Trump their need to rein in Israel. What was the nature of, what did they say? What did they say to impress upon Trump? I mean, it was right around that time, there was a $1 billion deal. Another one announced, I believe it was in Jeddah for Trump Inc. In Saudi Arabia. Is in the past, at least, it has seemed to me that there have been times where you have the leadership of some of these countries responding to the so-called Arab street. That dynamic seems to have been completely absent as far as most of the reporting, to the extent that I get a sense of it. But and somewhat replaced by a perhaps that is sort of like the incentive structure for these countries to also sort of offer Donald Trump, like, we can have a deal here in terms of like putting money in your pocket, more or less. Is that the dynamic that's happening here?
Well, I don't think Arab public opinion played a direct role in producing the proposal that we're now discussing. What I do think is fair to say is that, as you'll recall, when Trump had his victory tour in the Gulf earlier this year, he got commitments of massive investments from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from the United Arab Emirates, in the United States and in US politics. Of course, money not only talks, it screams, and it screams very loudly. But I think what was important in this meeting was, all these states and a number of leaders of Muslim states, Turkey, Pakistan, and Indonesia, they all made clear to Trump that this crisis needs to be brought to an end for a number of reasons. And given that this meeting included leaders of the countries that have pledged these massive investments in the US, I think Trump was genuinely attentive to their concerns. Let's put it that way.
You mentioned some of these Arab countries. There was reporting in the Washington Post over the weekend about the extent of the kind of behind-the-scenes security collaboration with the United States, with Israel, and some of these other countries that hadn't previously been reported, and what seems to be the connecting kind of motivation is a shared hawkishness towards Iran. Can you talk a little bit about that reporting and how it fits into the, abdication of responsibility towards the Palestinian neighbors by many of these leaders?
Well, as we've seen the past 2 years, Arab leaders as a whole have been quite content to play the role of inert spectators while Israel slaughters Palestinians in their own homeland. I think that's an attitude that's very sharply at variance with public opinion in the region. But where they draw the line is when Israel's plans for the Palestinians begins to impact directly on their territory, on their national security, on their domestic stability and legitimacy. That's why we saw them push back very hard against this so-called Trump Riviera plan, in which Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and potentially from the West Bank were basically going to be exported to Egypt, to Jordan, and further afield. In terms of the specific issue you're raising, this Washington Post report, showed that a number of Arab states have actually strengthened security relations and military relations with Israel during the past 2 years, quite contrary, to their statements of condemnation of the genocide and so on. The article identifies Iran as the main target of this military cooperation. I think we're now dealing with a rather different situation. First of all, Iran has, of course, been weakened, and many of these leaders now see Iran as essentially constrained, while Israel, which they have for years viewed as a valuable security and strategic partner, is now seen as kind of the regional arsonist, a regional pyromaniac that is being given an endless supply of fuel and matches by the United States, whether under Biden or now under Trump. And I think this explains their changed attitude that we saw so clearly in their meeting with Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly last month.
Is there any mechanism to even force Israel to adhere, or both the parties for that matter, to even just the first phase of this? I mean, seeing reports that Israel plans to diminish aid in Gaza because there have been the remains of 2 hostages have not been returned.
They bombed a sanitation center in the north in retaliation for supposed celebration for prisoners being released, to add to what you're saying. Yeah.
Is there any mechanism, like automated mechanisms, or is it going to require, because, following something like this, the sort of the media attention, the U.S. attention, particularly, with everything else that's going on with Trump, seems to diminish. And it's one of those things, okay, we can check this off. Genocide ended. Is there any mechanism to hold the parties to account here?
Well, if your question is about a specific mechanism incorporated into the terms of the agreement, I think the answer is no. I think there's a committee that's supposed to meet or whatever, but the answer is essentially no. Israel's interpretation of a ceasefire in Gaza is going to be very similar to what exists in Lebanon, where a ceasefire means that the Palestinians cease, but Israel continues to fire. And that's what we're already seeing in the Gaza Strip. There's ultimately really only one mechanism, and that is the United States. If the United States wants the ceasefire to be strictly upheld, it will make that clear to Israel, and Israel will have no choice what to obey. If Israel continues these kinds of attacks that you're asking me about, that means at the very least that it is doing so with the acquiescence and consent of the United States, because I think, as you suggested, now that the Gaza genocide is no longer dominating the headlines, there's a feeling that less needs to be done, and we can all move on to other things. And that ultimately, I think, is what will cause either the collapse of this agreement, or if it doesn't, produces the countdown to the next eruption of crisis.
It feels like, though, for the United States to do that, based upon our recent history, regardless of Biden or Trump, whoever was in office, that pressure, the only pressure that they seem to respond to is the pressure from, Qatar or from Saudi Arabia, and that's just a function of some hotel deals at this point. I mean, has that line been drawn directly enough? Because it feels like that seems to be the limiting principle here.
I don't quite agree. I think we have seen these states using their leverage with Washington. And of course, they've always had this leverage with Washington, whether it's with Trump or Biden, going back all the way to any of their predecessors. What I think is different this time is that there are also other elements of pressure, in addition to the leverage that can be brought to bear by states within the region. And it's not just the oil-rich Gulf states. You also have, for example, Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, and others. But you have 2 other factors. First of all, you have the growing divisions within the MAGA base, where on the one hand, you have, let's say, the Israel First constituency, the Christian Zionists, the neocons, the Iran hawks, and so on. But on the other, we've also seen the emergence of the non-interventionist faction, people who felt that it was not so much the Gaza genocide, but rather Israel's attack on Iran, and specifically U.S. participation in that attack, that for them was the final straw. And that's why you're seeing increasing criticism of Israel now from within that constituency. In addition, you have unprecedented popular mobilization in the West, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States. And I wouldn't simply dismiss the pressure of public opinion simply because it's primarily coming from the left and Trump feels he can ignore it. We already saw with the with the recent presidential election in the US that you ignore these constituencies at their peril. And I think that message is increasingly getting through to the political class in many Western states.
Well, to buttress your point, I mean, Trump was incredibly transactional about it, but he was meeting with certain, Muslim representatives prior to the election as well, in order to kind of shore some of that up, however paper thin it is. I want to just turn to Hamas for a second because, it feels like Trump kind of yanked Israel by the collar a little bit here. That's what it looks like, showing that Biden always had the ability to do this throughout the first part of the genocide. But there was this incredible clip. I mean, incredible in the sense that you couldn't believe the words were coming out of his mouth, of Trump on, I believe, Air Force One the other day, speaking about how they should leave some of the police work in the immediate aftermath of the ceasefire to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And can you lay out what that actually means? I mean, for me, this is Trump. Trump likes if you're the most powerful group, if you're the biggest group, and Hamas still is that in the Gaza Strip, which is a failure of Netanyahu's stated objectives, even though we know that those were false, but two, a failure of some of what Israel was trying to do in funding gangs that were fighting against Hamas internally in the Gaza Strip over the past 2 years of genocide. So if you could just give us a sense of where Hamas stands also in relation to this agreement.
Well, we have this unprecedented situation where on the 29th of September, standing on a podium alongside Netanyahu at the White House, Trump unveiled this proposal, basically said Hamas has several days to unconditionally accept this without any ifs, ands, or buts. And if they don't, they will face total obliteration. A few days later, Hamas responded to that proposal by accepting only elements of it, playing to Trump's narcissistic vanity by actually thanking him for putting out this proposal that essentially calls on Hamas to commit political suicide and ignoring those aspects of the proposal that they didn't like. And then you had this absolutely unprecedented situation where Trump reposted Hamas's response on his social media and proclaimed that they had accepted his proposal and therefore negotiations on its implementation could begin. In other words, the United States has now accepted that its proposal and the terms of its implementation are subject to negotiation and mutual agreement, because of course, Palestinians were not even consulted on the formulation of this proposal, whereas Israel was very deeply involved. Now you have a situation where the future governance of the Gaza Strip remains to be negotiated and agreed. And in the meantime, there's an urgent need for the reestablishment of law and order within the Gaza Strip, within those areas from which Israel has withdrawn. And Hamas, as you mentioned, has reemerged in public with its arms, imposing law and order, taking on collaborationist militias that are being dispatched by Israel to foment chaos and disorder. And when Trump was asked about this on Air Force One on his way to the Middle East, his response was, well, we are aware of this. And in fact, we recognize the need for the imposition of law and order and the chaos that is the Gaza Strip until arrangements are concluded about the future governance of the Gaza Strip. And essentially was saying, I know about this. It has my consent and authorization. You know, whether he's simply taking credit for something he's unable to stop, or whether perhaps the Egyptian and Qatari or perhaps others mediators communicated this to Trump and sought his approval for it is less clear.
Well, is it also a convenient pretext for future bombings for Netanyahu? Because when we're talking about his domestic political situation, Hamas reemerging immediately in the aftermath of this ceasefire is going to piss off everybody in his coalition, let alone even some of the so-called liberal Israelis who want the hostages back, but are okay with resuming the genocide once that occurs.
That's a very good question. It certainly could serve as a pretext. And I mean, you know, Israel will always find a pretext to conduct additional bombings and so on. But I think the key point to understand here now is that decisions about the future of this agreement, decisions about a partial or full-scale resumption of hostilities, are decisions that are not going to be made by Israel. They are decisions that are going to be made by the United States. If you see Israel bombing Palestinians, it killed 6 today. If you see it gradually, once again, escalating its aggression against the Gaza Strip, that means it has at least the passive acquiescence of Washington, if not its open support. If Washington, for any reason, feels the guns need to entirely fall silent, they will, regardless of what the Israeli government or its coalition partners think about the matter.
Can you tell us anything about the hostage exchange, prisoner exchange? The hundreds have been released from Israeli prisons, people who were detained without conviction, without any real charges, the hostages, essentially. But some remain in Israeli prisons, the most prominent of whom, Marwan Barghouti. Is there anything you can tell us about Hamas's efforts to secure the release of specific Palestinians in Israeli jails?
Well, I think the captive exchange is quite clearly a failure for Hamas. If you recall, in October 2023 and for a long period after that, Hamas made clear that the only exchange of captives it would accept was a release of all those that it held in exchange for all those in Israeli prisons. 2,000 have been released. So the vast majority of Palestinians that are held captive by Israel remain in its prison system. So we have to be clear about that.
Do we know how large that
it's
number
about
is?
8 to 10,000, if I'm not mistaken. And about 2,000 have now been released. 1,700 of those are Palestinians who were kidnapped from the Gaza Strip after October 2023 and who were being held without charge or trial and were being held specifically in order to increase Israel's leverage in a captive exchange. So these were also hostages. They included a young boy with autism, many women and children, and so on. And then 250 of those were supposed to be Palestinians who were serving life sentences. Now, my understanding is only 195 have been released, but I don't have specific numbers. That a number of them are Palestinians who were released in previous captive exchanges, but then rearrested. So those don't really belong in that category either. And a number of them were supposed to be released back to their homes in the West Bank. And at the last minute, Israel deported them to Egypt. There were 2 key figures that I think Hamas was very keen to include in this exchange. The first is a Fatah leader, Mouin Rabbani, who's been in prison since 2002. And he was crucial because he's not Hamas, he's a Fatah leader. And that way, Hamas would be able to demonstrate that it was acting in the national interest, if you will, rather than in its narrow factional interest. More importantly, he's seen as potentially the most effective challenger to the continued rule of Mahmoud Abbas and is considered his natural successor. And he's also someone who was keen to see Hamas integrated into the Palestinian national movement. And it's precisely for these reasons that Israel was determined to keep him in prison, preferably until he dies in prison. And that's also the reason, I think, that the Palestinian leadership, Ramallah Mahmoud Abbas, which has in the past been credibly accused of lobbying the Israelis and the Americans not to release Barouti, were this time probably also sending secret messages to Washington and to Israel not to accept his release. The other is Ahmed Saadat, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And in his case, it's a question of pure revenge because the PFLP, and I believe it was in 2002, has carried out the only successful assassination of an Israeli cabinet minister, Rehavam Zeevi, far-right minister of tourism at the time. And that was a reprisal for Israel's assassination of Saadat's predecessor as head of the PFLP.
The threat of a unified Palestinian national movement is ever present for Israel, and Barghouti in particular is a figure that could be that unifying force. Yes. I mean, they do it by land, segmenting the West Bank and Gaza, and of course East Jerusalem. Fragmentation. This is a colonial power 101.
Should just add that he polls as the most popular figure amongst Palestinians.
Right. And one more question on my end, Mouin. This yellow line piece of what I'm seeing in terms of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip basically saying that half of their land they are unable to return to because the territory is basically blocked off by Israel, despite them saying they're removing the IDF from the Gaza Strip. There have already been reports that people who have crossed the yellow line have been killed by Israel. I haven't confirmed that yet, but this could be another way to cram Palestinians into a smaller territory within the Gaza Strip itself. What are you hearing about those actions on the ground?
Correct, and that was in fact a major concession that Hamas made in the context of this agreement, that it did not insist on a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip within a defined timetable. So we had the first withdrawal to this yellow line. Then I believe after the remains of the last remaining Israeli hostages in the Gaza Strip are returned to Israel, then they will conduct a second and further withdrawal. But that I think is going to take a very long time, because also today the Red Cross is saying it's going to be extremely difficult to locate, identify, and retrieve those remains from what is essentially pulverized rubble that Gaza has been transformed into during Israel's genocidal military campaign of the past 2 years.
Before we let you go, I know an out here. Is there anything else you think that is important for us to note at this juncture?
Yes, I think it's crucial to understand that this cessation of hostilities is, of course, extraordinarily welcome, even if it turns out to be just temporary. At least, people who were facing constant bombing, genocide, famine, and so on, have at least gotten a stay of execution. And we should do everything within our power during this pause to ensure that it's prolonged and not just a pause. But the second point is what we have been discussing today is a ceasefire proposal, not a peace plan. And unless there is a concerted effort to address and resolve the underlying root causes of this crisis, first and foremost, the Palestinian right to self-determination, then we are counting down to the eruption of the next catastrophic crisis. It will be inevitable, whether it comes tomorrow, next year, or in a decade or two. It will be inevitable.
Mouin Rabbani, thank you so much for your time today. Much appreciated, and hope to speak to you again relatively soon, and hopefully things will have progressed and stayed on track on some level.
I hope so. It was a pleasure being with you, and thank you for the invitation.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.